I thought this video was going to be a quick week worth of work. I mean, just look up the dozen or so motorcycle makers we have and how long they've been around, right? Needless to say, I was pretty naive. Not only is there a seemingly endless list of makers, but finding information on them can be very time consuming. I stopped adding makers at around 155. How do you even decide how to organize such a video? Do you start a maker's timeline when the company was founded? Or do you start it when the company started making motorcycles? In the case of Husqvarna, you might be surprised to find out that the company has been around since 1689. Of course, back then they were only a firearms manufacturer. Technically, they didn't start making motorcycles until 1903. Another interesting point is that most motorcycle makers from the early years, that being the turn of the century, started out either making bicycles or fixing motors to bicycle frames. In fact, I would say most makers in the early years went through an evolution from motor bicycle to actual motorcycles. Another issue I ran into is, how do you define a motorcycle company? It's pretty easy in the case of maybe Harley-Davidson. They make motorcycles, and they always have. But it starts to get really complicated really quickly. There are many companies that produce many products and just happen to also produce motorcycles for a period of time. Many early car companies started out making motorcycles, then started making just cars, or perhaps both. Many motorcycle companies stopped making motorcycles and are now just making scooters or mopeds. Should a scooter or moped company count? A factor that influenced my decision not to include many companies is that there is now a large number of companies that just make 125cc motorcycles for the Asian market, and it's kind of unclear if they're doing their own engineering or just re-engineering Japanese or European designs with different fairings. Unsurprisingly, China is at the center of this practice. Because I have a particular disdain for the theft of intellectual property by the Chinese government/industry, I chose not to include many of their companies. Although I did include some companies that undoubtedly participated in design theft. My criteria for including companies is fairly broad, but it came down to a few specific criteria. Firstly, are they well known? This one's easy. Ducati may not make as many motorcycles as Yamaha, but they're very well known for good reasons. Next, do they produce a significant number of motorcycles? Were they significant to motorcycle history overall? Were they significant to the history of the country they came from? And finally, was I able to find information about the company? I gave up on some companies that were mentioned on different internet lists because there wasn't enough readily available information. I just don't have time to hunt down every little company from the early 1900s that made motorcycles for a couple months and then stopped. Okay, that's enough of a preamble. Let's get into this. I'm going to break this up geographically. And since the first motorcycle, Daimler Reitwagen, was made in Germany, and the first production motorcycle was also made in Germany, we'll start there. Germany, of course, is known for being an industrial powerhouse. They've made the right decisions, at least when it comes to manufacturing, going all the way back to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Many of you might not recognize the brands we have here aside from BMW. That's because all these other brands are economically insignificant compared to BMW. Nevertheless, they have their place in motorcycling history. Hildebrand and Wolfmüller, for example, were the first to mass-produce a purpose-built motorcycle. DKW was combined along with a few other car maker brands to make Auto Union in 1932. NSU was merged in 1969, and this brand is now known as Audi today. Opel is a car brand that's very successful in every market but the US market, but hasn't made motorcycles in decades. Triumph Werk Nuremberg, that's my best attempt at pronouncing that, was founded by Siegfried Bettmann in Nuremberg at the same time as the famous British Triumph. Many of y'all might not know that, a German guy founded Triumph. A few of the other brands have been revived, but most were either merged or became defunct. One thing that most, if not all of these German brands have in common is that they were at one time heavily involved in wartime production in either World War I or World War II, or both. BMW famously manufactured motors for aircraft as well as military motorcycles. Their air-cooled twins were copied by many other nations following the Second World War. The strains or stresses of World War were kind of a make-or-break situation for a lot of European brands. I found out something very interesting and funny while researching BMW. The designer for some of the most popular BMW brands ever was not German, but actually an American named David Raab. The R1000, the S1000 are just a couple of designs that David was responsible for. But the most interesting and funny fact is that David's brother was the lead singer for Hoobastank. No, I'm not joking. Oh, and his other brother was a bodyguard from Metallica. Let's go to Italy next. Italy's an interesting one. You could say that there's a direct correlation between a country's economic rank and their presence in the motorcycle industry. It would be a flimsy assertion, but you could still say it. If that can be said, then you would have to acknowledge that Italy has kind of a disproportionate presence compared to their economic output. I mean, they've dominated MotoGP. They just seem to have this strange staying power in the face of the Big Four from Japan. Italian motorcycles will always be at the top of the desirability scale. I've cobbled together 22 different Italian brands, and no, that won't cover every Italian motorcycle brand to exist. Again, I don't have time to research every one. Just like the German brands, many Italian brands had their factories bombed into rubble during the Second World War. But a cash infusion from good old Uncle Sam via the Marshall Plan was not wasted by the Italians. They bounced back during the mid-century period and rebuilt their industrial base, most of which is in the north of Italy. During this time, a strong foundation was laid for brands like Ducati, Aprilia, Moto Guzzi, MV Agusta, etc. Several dormant Italian brands like Fantic, Mondial, Malaguti, again I don't know if I'm pronouncing those right, they've been revived, but as far as I can tell they're using motors from other manufacturers. Whereas companies like Ducati, Aprilia, Moto Guzzi, MV Agusta, they're still actively engineering both chassis and motors. And that's no simple feat. Welding up a frame and maybe hammering out a tank is one thing, but engineering, casting, and machining your own engine blocks is another. What it takes to have a full-fledged motorcycle company is more than most people realize. Not any country can just up and produce top-tier vehicles. It requires a lineage of human capital and knowledge that's just passed down from generation to generation. To this day, Italy possesses something that can't be reproduced, and people will pay for it. In fact, companies from competitor countries will pay Italians for it. What is that thing? Well, I'm not going to act like I have some new insight into the subject. This is not a new concept. You've heard it before. Italian motorcycles, just like their cars, their wines, cheeses, operas, etc., they have soul, they have style, they pursue performance with reckless abandon, often at the cost of reliability, but not always. If Italians weren't capable of making practical and reliable designs, then Piaggio wouldn't dominate the scooter market in Europe, which they do. Oh, and Piaggio owns a ton of other Italian motorcycle brands these days. So yeah, that's just a few of Italy's brands. Next up, we have France. As a half French person, this one's a bit sad for me. We all know that France is capable of making incredible things. The Concorde, Eurobus airliners, Dassault jet fighters, and then the famous French car makers Peugeot, Citroën, Renault, and Bugatti. So, why don't the French have the same presence in the motorcycle world as Germany, Italy, the UK? Hell if I know. But that's not to say that they don't or didn't make motorcycles. Again, this isn't every French brand. You'll notice that Peugeot is on the list. I've seen one Peugeot motorcycle in my life, and it was at a museum. Of course, I live in Texas. If I lived in Europe, I probably still wouldn't have seen a Peugeot motorcycle, but that's because they haven't made motorcycles in a long time. They're more focused on scooters. After having a 51% stake of the company purchased by the Mahindra Group from India, they did announce a couple of small displacement motorcycles in 2018. But as far as I can tell, they haven't entered mass production quite yet. So other than boutique motorcycles, the French really aren't making anything other than scooters. And though I didn't really want to include a bunch of boutique makers, I figured I'd throw the French a bone since they don't have a ton of other current makers. Midwal, I don't really know how it's pronounced. I should know because I'm French, but they're an interesting maker who is currently offering motorcycles for the budget-friendly price of $180,000. And yeah, they're beautiful. Also, they have a cool boxer engine that's set up parallel to the wheels instead of perpendicular like you'll see in like all the BMW designs and the different Russian motorcycles. I don't see the French making a dent in the motorcycle world anytime soon. Kind of takes a while to build up a fan base, and they just haven't made it a priority like the Germans and the Italians and the British have. This next one will be pretty quick. España. I knew next to nothing about Spanish motorcycle makers before researching this video. I'm not sure why, but they haven't managed to pull off what their Southern European brothers in Italy have as far as a huge imprint on the motorcycling world. My theory is that their naming is holding them back. Bull Taco, Derby, Gas, Lube, or if you read it in English, Lube. Come on. That sounds like members of a nu metal band from 1997. Even Don Draper couldn't fix that. Okay, I'm joking, of course. The Spaniards are just as passionate as the Italians, and they churn out a steady stream of talented racers for MotoGP, with 54 riders and 697 wins. That's pretty good if you ask me. Although these brands aren't huge, they do have their following, and some of them are fairly popular in their own segment of the market. Gas was purchased by KTM, and I saw one of their dirt bikes at my local dealership. Let me just say, the all-red look is very nice. Moving on, the British. The Brits, as a whole, easily one of the most interesting stories in motorcycling. Great Britain was largely where the Industrial Revolution began and emanated from. The Second Industrial Revolution, that's right, there was two, was no different, and innovation and entrepreneurship were blowing up in the UK pretty much from the turn of the century all the way to the middle of the 20th century. The Brits were dominating the motorcycle world up until the 60s, basically. According to Canadian writer Ian Chadwick, there were 700 different British motorcycle marques registered prior to the Depression. I only have 34 brands here, but that beats out the rest of the countries in this video quite handily. The biggest name in this group is Triumph, of course, and what's fascinating about Triumph is they survived to this day because of one man, really, John Bloor. It's a long and complicated story, but by the early 80s, the British motorcycle industry had been all but beaten to death, and it didn't look like they would survive the rise of the Japanese motorcycle industry at all. John Bloor stepped in and purchased the rights to the name Triumph and ensured that there was an unbroken stream of Triumphs produced from 1903 until today, making Triumph the second longest running British motorcycle company after Royal Enfield. It took an estimated $100 million for Bloor to revive the brand into a proper motorcycle maker. And when I say proper, I mean that the company engineers motorcycles from the ground up. I'm talking new and exciting models, not just nostalgia bikes. Why am I stressing this? I'm stressing it because different investors have attempted to revive many British motorcycle brands to varying degrees of success. Sadly, it's usually a failure because they'll just cobble together some nostalgia bike with existing parts and slap a marquee on a tank. It takes way more than that to make a successful brand, and I don't really have time to get into it in this video. Luckily, I do have a script written about Triumph already. The point is, when you look at what it really takes to make a motorcycle brand, a lot of brands exist today because of sheer willpower and passion, not just economy and logic. In the same vein, I can't ignore Royal Enfield. Although Royal Enfield is of British origin, you could safely call it an Indian brand at this point. To oversimplify things, Royal Enfield, along with other British brands, was snuffed out. That is, except in India. The Indians have not only kept the brand alive, but have expanded it into one of the most popular brands worldwide. Believe you me, as a brand that harnesses heritage to sell bikes, they are more than keeping Triumph and Harley-Davidson on their toes. Because I don't have time to talk about every single British brand, I'll wrap this section up by talking about Norton. They were relaunched in 2008, and according to my research, they've received a $125 million cash infusion from TVS, who is, once again, from India. The road's been bumpy for Norton fans, though. Basically, part of the relaunch saga included a CEO taking the money and running. The guy literally bought a castle to work out of, complete with 16 Aston Martins. You gotta actually make a successful business before you start blowing cash, my guy. Sadly, this illustrates how difficult it is for a brand to be successfully relaunched and more so sustained. It takes the perfect amalgamation of passion, moxie, and business prowess. Oh, and I guess the timing needs to be right too. Relaunching a brand in the current economic climate, that would be in 2023, could be a huge mistake if you ask me. Europe. This next group is going to be multiple European countries, since none of them have enough brands to be a separate category. Although a couple of these brands have a pretty big presence in the motorcycling world. The Swedes and the Austrians, for example, KTM, Husqvarna, Austrian and Swedish, respectively. They're both huge in the motocross/enduro world, and KTM makes some amazing road bikes as well. KTM owns Husqvarna currently, so all the Swedish and Austrian engineering genius is kind of concentrated together. One thing that a lot of these European brands have in common is that they probably produced something besides motorcycles at one time in their history. And that includes military production, especially around the World Wars. You can see how much of an effect that the wars had on Europe in that some of these countries don't even exist anymore. Lauren and Clement was in the Kingdom of Bohemia, which became Czechoslovakia, which then became the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and so on and so forth. When it comes to countries that were part of the Soviet Union or part of the communist Eastern Bloc, you have companies such as Ural, Minsk, Dnieper, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and even Jawa. They weren't known for innovation, with many of them just making copies of German designs. I do give these companies a little bit of a pass, since they were in communist countries and making cool bikes was way less important than meeting state quotas. Unsurprisingly, for this list, you'll see that a country's ability to produce motorcycles and other vehicles is roughly proportionate to their country's overall manufacturing output and their population. See, like Norway is represented in this list, and they have a rich economy, but it's less of a manufacturing economy and more of a fishing and oil and mining economy. There's a lot more that could be said for this portion of the video, but we have a bunch of other categories to look at, so we're gonna have to move on. China and India. Some of you might be wondering why I would put both of these countries in the same category, and that would be a fair question. But it's basically about how both of these countries have come up in the industrialized world and how they approach manufacturing. To say that China has the ability to manufacture is more than an understatement, obviously. Wherever you are while you're watching this video, I guarantee 100% of you have more than one item made in China within arm's reach. And while India doesn't have the same size economy as China, their time in the sun is coming. Make no mistake. Several of these companies are included in the top 5 of makers by unit sales. Hero, Baja, and TVS hold almost 20% of the world market together. Sadly, I'd say that neither of these countries is in the practice of innovation. There are many reasons which are too complicated to get to in this video, but it has a lot to do with practicality, the age of the countries involved, meaning how long they've been industrialized, propensity of Asian countries to be more conformist than individualist, and ease of doing business. Either way, the size of the Chinese and Indian markets alone mean they'll be a massive part of motorcycling for the foreseeable future. the United States, what can I say? We make real motorcycles out of steel, leather, and pure freedom. All other motorcycles are plastic ponies for tight pants wearing Eurotrash sissies. No, but seriously, the United States motorcycle scene is unique for a few reasons. For one, we usually ride bigger bikes, and we're famous for our long, open highways. Which is why America's biggest brand, Harley-Davidson, has managed to survive for more than 100 years. And Indian is back as well. They were basically the only other brand besides Harley-Davidson to survive the Great Depression. Prior to the Great Depression and the World Wars, the American motorcycle scene was very similar to the British in that there were a ton of different marques. Although Harley survives today, they've definitely had their rough patches. I think most people would say that the AMF days of the 1970s were the dark ages for Harley. However, Harley could be looking at their worst days coming in the next decade. Harley really blasted off into the massive brand it is now because of the boomer generation. Unfortunately, their main sales demographic is aging out of riding. So for today's United States brands, really you have Harley and Indian along with a couple electric motorcycle companies like Zero and Lightning. And since they're in the business of making big and very expensive bikes, it kind of remains to be seen if they'll survive the coming economic turmoil. Latin America has 3 countries in the top 15 for number of riders. That would be Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina. And the 2 brands I have here are Italica from Mexico and United Motors of Colombia. They both seem to have kind of an identity crisis or an identity issue in that the Mexican brand seems to want to be Italian and the Colombian brand is headquartered in Miami and has attempted to brand itself as American. Technically, United Motors is a US company on paper, but they were founded in Colombia and I don't think they actually try to sell bikes in America. And that's a good thing because their so-called American branding is nothing more than an embarrassing caricature of American culture. Either way, both companies make a lot of two-wheelers, so they made the list. Korea and Taiwan. I should have included these with the China and India category, but I kind of forgot, so these brands get their own category. I was expecting to see a Thai brand, given that they have the highest ridership numbers per capita in the world, but any company in Thailand is either manufacturing for a foreign maker like BMW, Harley, or Honda, and the rest are known as assemblers. I didn't know much about the Korean or Taiwanese motorcycle world, but I assume Korean motorcycles are taking roughly the same path as Korean cars, but maybe at a delayed rate. That is to say, Korean cars were once considered the cheapest of the cheap as far as, design and reliability and quality, but they've definitely stepped up their game big time, if you ask me. Some of you younger viewers probably don't remember what Korean cars looked like maybe in the 90s, early 2000s, but they're night and day from what they are now. I believe I've seen one Hyosung motorcycle in my life, and it looked like a Kawasaki from the late 90s, which isn't surprising because Hyosung used to make licensed designs from Japanese makers. With the electrification of motorcycles, Korea might show up big on this scene. I mean, nobody was buying Korean TVs until all of a sudden everyone seems to have an LG or a Samsung. As far as Taiwan, they seem to be serving the same markets as any other East Asian country aside from Japan, and they make small displacement motorcycles and scooters. Of course, we know that Taiwan is capable of making world-class products. They make most of the advanced microchips for the world. But I don't see either Korea or Taiwan supplanting any European or Japanese brands anytime soon, at least for motorcycles. But they definitely run a good scooter game as far as I can tell. And finally, we've arrived in Japan. They might not have the largest spread as far as number of different brands, but I do have to tell you they are world beaters when it comes to motorcycles. They are the standard against which all other motorcycles are measured. Honda alone manufactures 30% of the motorcycles in the world. That's insane. In Japan, we have what are called the Big Four. Metallica, different list. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki. Something that all these brands have in common is that they are massive corporations. Most of you already know that all 4 of them make other products besides motorcycles. Yamaha makes pianos, guitars, drums, amplifiers, audio-visual equipment, outboard motors, wave runners, ATVs, UTVs, etc. Kawasaki's parent company, Kawasaki Heavy Industries, makes ships, power plants, industrial robots, trains, aircraft, space systems, helicopters, simulators, jet engines, missiles, various electronic equipment, and more. Suzuki makes cars, ATVs, outboard motors, wheelchairs, and small engines, and I'm sure there's other things that I missed. Honda makes cars, ATVs, generators, small engines, robots, aircraft, and bicycles, and I believe they just basically make motors for all different applications. Suffice it to say, they're massive, and it's no surprise that their motor divisions are really good at making motorcycles.
Don't worry, Canadians, I did remember you. A little bit late, but I did remember. So we do have 2 Canadian brands. If I had any foresight, I would have just included them with the United States and made a North America timeline, but we have Bombardier, which owns Can-Am, and of course some of our older viewers will remember that Can-Am used to make 2-wheel motorcycles. I think they were all motocross oriented stuff, starting in 1971, and they evolved into making ATVs in the 90s, I believe, and nowadays they make ATVs, UTVs, and those weird three-wheelers that you see driving around, which may seem weird to people who live in California or Texas or Florida, but you have to remember that Canada is frozen much of the time, so that extra wheel and extra element of balance is helpful. So yeah, I did not forget completely. There's your 2 Canadian brands. There are a couple more, but again, they're small boutique makers, and I don't really have the time anymore to research because I've done hundreds of hours of research for this video. So yeah.
I'm sure I missed some important brands, but I figured it'd be interesting to take a look at all these brands in this timeline format. So, did I miss your favorite brand? Just let me know in the comments. If you dig this kind of content, definitely subscribe. Until next time, goodbye.